A handful of votes once stood between him and the papacy itself. Now, in a turn that would be almost too ironic for fiction, he may be forced to leave the very office he currently occupies within the church he nearly came to lead. His name is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and the rumor now circulating through the corridors of the Vatican is significant enough that it has begun shaking the confidence of officials who have depended on his continued presence for over a decade. Leo XIV, according to reports, is reportedly considering removing him from his post. A caution is necessary before going further. For now, this remains a rumor, reported specifically by the website The Pillar and attributed to anonymous sources within the Roman Curia. It has not been confirmed by any official Vatican communication, but institutional insiders and long-time Vatican watchers alike understand something about how information of this kind circulates in Rome. When rumors of this specific character, naming a specific office and a specific successor list, begin moving through Vatican corridors with this degree of detail, they are rarely entirely without foundation. They tend to originate from somewhere real, even when the final outcome remains genuinely uncertain. By the end of this video, you will understand who Cardinal Parolin actually is, why he became, for over a decade, arguably the single most powerful man in the Vatican after the Pope himself, and why his potential removal from office would represent something considerably larger than a routine personnel change. It would mark, if it happens, the visible conclusion of an entire era of Vatican governance. But who is Cardinal Parolin in the fullest sense that the question deserves? To understand him properly, one has to set aside any image of a scheming Renaissance-style prelate maneuvering purely for personal advancement, because that caricature does not match the man or his actual career. Parolin is, first and foremost, a diplomat, and by most accounts, the most genuinely skilled diplomat the Holy See has produced in several decades. Venetian by origin, trained at the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, the Holy See's own diplomatic school that has for centuries produced the men who staff nunciatures around the world, Parolin spent decades in the field of Vatican diplomacy before being recalled to Rome to assume the highest position available to a career diplomat within the Curia. In 2013, Pope Francis appointed him Secretary of State. This is, by any honest accounting, the most consequential office in the entire Vatican apparatus after the papacy itself. The Secretary of State functions, in practical terms, as something close to the Vatican's Prime Minister. He coordinates the work of the various dicasteries that make up the Curia, manages the day-to-day operational governance of the Holy See, and serves as the primary point of contact between the Vatican and the governments of the world. For over a decade under Francis, Parolin occupied that position continuously, becoming what Vatican observers came to describe as the eternal number two, the quiet and largely invisible architect behind an enormous share of the Vatican's actual policy execution during those years. And his influence was never confined to internal Vatican administration alone. Parolin became, across those years, the visible face of the Catholic Church in the world's most sensitive and consequential diplomatic situations. Wars requiring careful Vatican mediation, peace negotiations where the Holy See's moral authority was invoked as a potential bridge between hostile parties, relations with the major world powers from Washington to Beijing to Moscow. Wherever an international crisis touched on matters where the Vatican's voice carried weight, Parolin's diplomatic signature was frequently somewhere in the background of the Church's response. But here the story arrives at the achievement, or the controversy, that has followed Parolin more persistently than any other single element of his career, the one that functions almost as his permanent shadow, regardless of whatever else he accomplishes. The agreement with China. In 2018, the Holy See signed a provisional agreement with the Chinese Communist government concerning the appointment of Catholic bishops within China. The mechanism, kept largely confidential in its precise details even now, worked roughly as follows. The Pope would retain formal approval over episcopal appointments, but candidates for those appointments would also require the approval of the Chinese Communist Party's own religious affairs apparatus. For Parolin and his defenders within and outside the Curia, this arrangement represented the only realistic path to keeping the Catholic Church functioning as a living institution inside China, rather than abandoning millions of Chinese Catholics entirely to a state-controlled religious structure with no meaningful connection to Rome. Dialogue, in this reading, was the only mechanism available to prevent an outright and permanent schism between Chinese Catholicism and the Universal Church. But for the agreement's critics, and there have been many, including cardinals with no reputation for reflexive traditionalism or reactionary politics, the 2018 agreement represented something closer to a surrender. It effectively handed the selection of Catholic pastors in China over to an officially atheist regime with a documented history of persecuting religious believers. And in doing so, it turned its back on the underground church, the network of bishops, priests, and lay faithful, who had spent decades resisting state control at enormous personal cost. Refusing to register with the state-sponsored Catholic Patriotic Association precisely because doing so meant accepting a structure not genuinely in communion with Rome. The faithful who had paid the highest price for that resistance were, in the years following the agreement, frequently the ones left worst off by its practical implementation. Bishops of the underground church, who had refused for decades to compromise with the Chinese Communist Party, found themselves increasingly overtaken and sidelined by candidates the regime itself favored and had effectively pre-selected. Those who had resisted state control were marginalized. Those who had been willing to work within the party's preferred structure found themselves rewarded with recognition and advancement. Cardinal Joseph Zen, the elderly and famously outspoken former bishop of Hong Kong, went so far as to describe the entire arrangement publicly as a betrayal, using language considerably harsher than most cardinals permit themselves regarding a sitting pope's diplomatic initiative. That agreement, renewed multiple times in the years since 2018 despite ongoing controversy, remains shrouded in a level of secrecy unusual even by the Vatican's own long-standing institutional standards. No complete public text of the agreement has ever been released. Its precise terms remain a matter of informed speculation rather than documented public record. This is the essential paradox that defines Cardinal Parolin's entire legacy. A man committed to dialogue as an operating principle, willing to sit at a negotiating table with virtually any counterpart, regardless of that counterpart's record on religious freedom or human rights, and precisely because of that unwavering commitment to dialogue, a man widely suspected, by critics both inside and outside the Church, of having consistently prioritized diplomatic engagement over the more difficult and costly work of prophetic witness. And then there is the moment that revealed, more clearly than any other single episode in his career, the full scope of his own institutional ambition. The conclave of 2025, the one that ultimately elected the man who became Leo XIV. Parolin was not merely one candidate among many entering that conclave. He was, by every credible account that has since emerged, the clear frontrunner, the candidate whose name circulated most consistently in the days leading up to the cardinal's entry into isolation. Reports that have since emerged describe him as the conclave's most significant loser in the specific sense that matters most in papal elections. He reportedly came in second in the balloting, accumulating somewhere between 40 and 50 votes across the various rounds, a substantial and genuinely formidable base of support within the College of Cardinals, but falling well short of the 89 votes required to secure the two-thirds majority necessary for election. He came, by any reasonable reading of those numbers, remarkably close to the papacy itself, closer than almost any other cardinal in that conclave besides the man who ultimately prevailed. And then Cardinal Prévost, now known to the Catholic world as Leo XIV, overtook him in the later rounds of balloting and secured the necessary majority. Consider for a moment the human dimension of that scene. A man who had spent over a decade as the Vatican's permanent and indispensable number 2, watching in real time as his own long-anticipated path to becoming number 1 dissolved in the final rounds of a conclave he had entered as the favorite. And then, the following morning, required by the ordinary demands of institutional continuity to continue serving, with every appearance of full cooperation and loyalty, the very man who had just taken from him the position he had spent decades positioning himself to eventually hold. In every public appearance since, naturally, everything has remained entirely correct. Smiles, expressions of obedience, visible cooperation between the new Pope and his experienced Secretary of State. But it is widely understood within Vatican circles, among those who have spent careers observing how institutional power actually operates inside the Curia, that wounds of this particular kind, wounds that touch directly on a man's lifelong ambition and his sense of his own destined role, are rarely healed by a public handshake and a photograph of cordial cooperation. And here we arrive at the present moment, because the tension that many observers assumed would quietly dissolve over time, absorbed into the ordinary rhythms of institutional cooperation between a pope and his most senior official, appears never to have genuinely gone away. According to the rumor now circulating, Leo XIV has developed real doubts about Parolin's continued effectiveness in coordinating the dicasteries, the complex machinery of departments and offices that together constitute the operational body of the Roman Curia. In plain terms, the Pope may no longer consider him the right man to continue leading that machinery into the next phase of this pontificate. And the names of possible successors are already circulating with enough specificity to suggest this is more than idle speculation. Archbishop Paul Gallagher, who has served for years as the Vatican's Secretary for Relations with States, functioning in practice as something close to the Holy See's foreign minister, is one name being mentioned. Archbishop Fortunatus Nwachukwu, a Nigerian prelate with his own distinguished record within Vatican diplomatic service, is another. These are two genuinely distinct profiles, and the choice between them, should Leo actually proceed with a change at the top of the Secretariat of State, would itself signal something important about the direction the new pontificate intends to take. Removing a sitting Secretary of State is never merely a technical personnel matter, a routine reshuffling of the kind that happens periodically in any large bureaucratic institution. It is one of the strongest and most consequential gestures a pope can make in asserting his own vision for how the Church should be governed and in what direction it should move. It would signal unmistakably that Leo XIV intends to govern with his own team, shaped by his own priorities, rather than continuing to operate through the inherited architecture of Francis's Vatican. It would represent, in the clearest terms available to Vatican observers, the formal conclusion of what might be called the Parolin era of Vatican diplomacy, the particular style of engagement that produced, among its most significant and controversial legacies, the 2018 agreement with Beijing. But what does any of this actually mean for the ordinary Catholic sitting in a pew somewhere far from Rome, someone who knows little about the internal workings of Vatican corridors and, quite reasonably, wants to know even less about the personal ambitions and disappointments of career diplomats? It means considerably more than the surface-level palace intrigue might initially suggest, because behind a possible change in leadership at the Secretariat of State lies a genuinely consequential question about the fundamental character of Vatican engagement with the world going forward. What kind of diplomacy does the Catholic Church actually want to practice in this era? Is it the kind of diplomacy that, in order to remain seated at the table with the powerful, proves willing to remain largely silent and to make substantial concessions, as many critics believe was demonstrated in the agreement with China and in the treatment of the underground church's most faithful and most persecuted members? Or is it a diplomacy willing to return to speaking with genuine clarity, even at the real cost of displeasing governments whose cooperation the Vatican might otherwise prefer to maintain on more comfortable terms? Because the Catholic Church, whatever else she is, and whatever practical diplomatic instruments she necessarily employs in a world of nation-states and international institutions, is not fundamentally an embassy conducting foreign policy on behalf of a sovereign territory. Her actual strength across 2,000 years of recorded history has never rested primarily on skillful negotiation. It has rested on testimony. The martyrs who converted the ancient world did not do so by signing favorable diplomatic agreements with the Roman emperors who persecuted them. They did so by shedding their blood publicly and refusing every offered compromise that would have preserved their lives at the cost of their confession. When diplomacy quietly replaces prophecy as the Church's primary mode of engagement with worldly power, the institution may indeed gain something in the currency of improved relationships with governments and reduced friction with powerful states. But it risks losing something considerably more valuable in the exchange: its distinctive voice. The very thing that made the early Church's witness so disruptive and ultimately so world-transforming in the first place. In fairness, and this needs to be stated clearly before drawing any final conclusions, governing a church present across every continent and embedded within the political realities of dozens of different nations, many of them hostile or at best ambivalent toward Catholic institutional presence, genuinely requires prudence, patient mediation, and a demonstrated capacity to communicate constructively with governments the Church cannot simply ignore or antagonize without consequence for the actual Catholics living under those governments. Diplomacy itself is not an inherently corrupting instrument. It is a tool, morally neutral in itself, and its value depends entirely on the purposes toward which it is directed and the limits that are respected in its exercise. Cardinal Parolin is not, by any fair accounting, a traitor to be publicly pilloried or reduced to a caricature of institutional cynicism. He is a man of the Church who served with genuine intelligence and dedication across an unusually demanding decade, and who, in all likelihood, approached the China agreement in good faith, genuinely convinced at the time that he was securing the best realistically available outcome for millions of Chinese Catholics who would otherwise have been left with no meaningful connection to Rome at all. The real issue at stake, then, is not fundamentally about the man himself and his personal character or intentions. It is about the underlying line of policy his tenure came to represent, and whether that line continues to serve the Church well as she moves into whatever comes next under Leo XIV's governance. And the genuinely important question, the one that deserves far more attention than the surface-level drama of who occupies which office, is whether Leo XIV, through this potential move, intends simply to change the face occupying the Secretariat of State while leaving the underlying diplomatic approach fundamentally intact, or whether he intends something considerably more significant, an actual change of course in how the Vatican engages with hostile and authoritarian governments going forward. Because this is precisely what the faithful watching these developments unfold ought to be looking for beneath the surface-level rumors and speculation about names and successors. Not the game of musical chairs itself, interesting as institutional gossip might be to those who follow it closely, but the direction it potentially signals. A new Secretary of State could turn out to be simply another skilled career diplomat, continuing essentially the same approach with a different personal style. Or his appointment could genuinely represent something more meaningful, a visible sign that the Church under this pontificate intends to place the demands of Christ and the witness owed to persecuted believers ahead of purely calculated diplomatic considerations in situations where those two priorities come into genuine tension. Only the facts as they unfold in the months ahead, not the rumors circulating now, will ultimately reveal which of these two possibilities is actually taking shape. So rather than becoming excessively absorbed in the speculative game of naming successors and handicapping Vatican politics as though it were simply a matter of court intrigue to be followed for its own entertainment value, the more genuinely useful response available to ordinary Catholics is prayer. Prayer that whoever ultimately leads the Church's diplomatic engagement with the world does so as a servant of the gospel, first and foremost, rather than as a purely worldly functionary primarily concerned with maintaining comfortable relationships with powerful governments, regardless of the cost to persecuted believers under those governments' authority. History, after all, consistently teaches one clarifying lesson that transcends any single pontificate or any single Secretary of State. Great Secretaries of State eventually pass from their offices one way or another. The regimes they negotiate with, however powerful and permanent they may appear in any given historical moment, sooner or later collapse under the weight of their own internal contradictions or simply the passage of time. And the Church remains standing through all of it, because her true and enduring power has never actually resided in palaces, diplomatic agreements, or skillful negotiations with the temporarily powerful. It resides entirely and irreducibly in the person of Christ, whom she exists to proclaim, regardless of which governments currently hold power in any given era. Consider, across the full sweep of the Church's history, how many prime ministers of the Vatican, however that specific office has been titled across different centuries, have succeeded one another in service to a long line of popes. Some among them were genuinely saintly men, others were highly skilled administrators whose competence served the institution well in their own time. Still others have been almost entirely forgotten by history, their names surviving only in specialized scholarly footnotes. Of the great majority of them, remarkably little of lasting significance actually remains in the collective memory of the faithful. But the faith they were each, in their own way, meant to serve and to protect, has reached us fully intact across every one of those intervening centuries, regardless of how skillfully or how poorly any individual official happened to serve in his particular moment. Whether Cardinal Parolin ultimately remains in his current office or is eventually replaced then, matters considerably less in the final accounting than what the office itself is actually made to serve going forward. Opening doors to worldly powers on terms that preserve comfortable diplomatic relationships, or faithfully preserving and proclaiming the faith even when doing so proves diplomatically costly. That is where everything of lasting significance in this story truly depends, regardless of which name eventually occupies the office in question. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.